Hello, everybody. Just starting, just making sure everything is going. I don't yet see us complete up. Okay, we are officially good. Just starting, just making sure everything is going. Sound off. Okay, we are sorry for that. A little delay there. It's been a quick, crazy night here. So I apologize in advance. All right, we are good to get going though. Hello and welcome to part 5 of 6 of our series in preparation for the United States Regents given here in the state of New York. And what we're going to be working on today is continuing in our packet. And we are officially moving on to the part 2 part of our packet. And I will tell you that this is the part 2 part of the packet is much simpler. Next week's review has a lot more to do with kind of comparing and contrasting and charts and graphs and some pretty neat analyzation stuff. So that today is really the last day of some of our big lessons to this. I just realized I've got a reflection behind me, and that's going to stay that way. I apologize. Maybe I can make my arm go away. When we're working in our packet today, it is pages 83 to pages 105. Today we're going to be talking mostly about the Cold War, and particularly the United States War and kind of what we did during the Cold War, what we didn't do during the Cold War. So we're not really focusing on the it's obviously going to be an international lesson, but we're really not looking too much into kind of what was going on, particularly in the Soviet Union at the time, global. But we will be getting, we're going to be talking about other countries today because that's just part of what the Cold War has to do with. We're going to be talking about some military police actions and conflicts, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War, because they all come up in the Cold War. I do, I like to give a little kind of preface that because we are working with a workbook, I do kind of check down and check my notes a little bit more than normal because I want to make sure that I'm doing something that can be followed along with at home. And when we get to the questions part, if you've watched the other parts of the series, when we get to the parts about questions, multiple choice questions and such, I just kind of go through the answers really quickly. If you are able to watch this live, which is amazing, I do see that I got a few people watching. That's great. And use the chat to particularly ask questions about today's unit. If you are not currently enrolled in my class and you don't have a copy of the pack, please feel free to email me. My email address is kbidelspa, BIDELSPACH, at perucs.org, or you can also you can message me on YouTube so I can check it out that way. So that's what we're looking at today. Now, I said we were working on pages 83, starting at page 83, but I did want to go back a little bit to last week's lesson to kind of end, to take a look there. And if you turn to page 60 in the unit we did last week, we talked about the end of World War II, because really what happened, to understand the Cold War, we do need to make sure that we understand what went on previous to. So this is kind of a recap of what we talked about last week, because history is always building on the previous story. It's just a story, but understanding, you don't read Harry Potter starting at page, at the third book. You read it from the first book so that you can work along. So let's look at the end of World War. So the end of World War II, you have two superpowers really emerge at the end of World War II: the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had once been called the U.S., had been once called just Russia. But what happens is in 1914, and this is a global history, but in 1914, the Russians become a communist country, and they become the Soviet Union, or the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And the difference between communism and socialism is a political and a economic difference. The idea, a little bit through these lessons about communism and capitalism before, but the basic idea is that in communism, nothing is privatized. So let's say I'm a farmer, and I've been a farmer for 1,000 years. You get the point. If I'm in a communist country, I don't own that farm, nor do I own any of the products that are grown on that farm. So I'm a potato farmer and I grew 10 tons of potatoes. At the end of my potato growing, or the whole through the season, my potatoes are taken from me because they're not mine. And the state, or that's what many, state is what outside the United States people call countries. So the country, the government takes all of my potatoes and to the government store, because all the stores are going to be government run, and those potatoes are then sold to all the people who want to buy potatoes, including myself. Even though I was the grower of the potato, I have to buy that potato back, because that potato in reality is not actually my potato. It is the government's potato. So the government owns my farm, owns my house, it owns, what I'm producing. And they'll give me money for having grown the potatoes. And then I can take that money and go buy my potatoes with it. And that's just on the kind of the small scale, but everything is done that way. So all of the factories are government owned. And, if you work in a factory, the government provides, the house you live in, the medical care you receive. And it sounds actually in reality, sounds like everyone is treated very fairly, but obviously I think you can probably see the flaws in the system. Some people are going to work harder, some people are going to work less. You also have, inevitably in communism, basically somebody who does rise to power that is seen as kind of better than the other citizens. You can think of Fidel Castro in Cuba. That was, he was very much a dictator in a country that should have been equality for all and everyone getting treated fairly. But the point of this is that after World War II, you have the United States, a capitalist country that we've talked about. So everything is privatized. So, if you want to be a rubber band salesman, you can be a rubber band salesman. If you make a lot of money, you make a lot of money. And if you don't make money, then you don't make money. That's kind of the choice you make by the decisions you make. So you have the United States as capitalist, and you have the Soviet Union as communist. And this, they were friends during World War II. But this comes to a real head after World War II. The United States do not get along after World War II. And the other thing is, if you remember, World War II in the Pacific front, so talking about the place, in the war in the Pacific, meaning like Japan, the war pretty much ended because the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the United States had nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union was certainly not going to be okay with that either. They wanted, of course, a nuclear weapon also. So there's going to be a nuclear arms race. So that's what I wanted to kind of talk about with kind of the end of World War II and how does this impact the Cold War that was going to be following us through. And like I said, I'm just looking a little bit back on last week's. If you go back to page 66 from last week's lesson, some of the things that we can look at there, we refer to an iron curtain. And right now, just Google really quick. Just go into Google and search Iron Curtain, and you're going to see a map that will separate Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and that is the the Eastern Soviet countries are their Soviet and their Soviet satellite countries that the Soviet Union, you're going to be communist, and then you're going to see Western Europe that's capitalist. And that kind of dividing line, and a lot of times you'll see this is blue and red. If you're looking this up on your maps, like I just asked you to do, Google that up, Iron Curtain. That dividing line was referred to as the Iron Curtain, meaning that communism can't get any further than where that Iron Curtain is. That is the border. Communism can't go any further into Western Europe. It's fine that it's there in Eastern Europe, but that's it. It can't go any further. And that's also referred to as containment. So I do this whenever I think of containment. You think of a container, right? Like a Tupperware container. What's the point of a Tupperware container? You get leftover soup. You're going to pour the container in, and that container is going to make it so the soup can't get out, right? And that's what the idea of containment during the Cold War really has to do with, is it's the idea of keeping the communist countries that already exist contained. They can't spread. The rest of the world can't go red. And I say that because a lot of times when we think of communism, the color that is associated with communism is red. So the rest of the globe can't go red. And this is going to be huge. This is what the United States takes on as their official doctrine about foreign policies, is that we're going to follow the policy of containment, okay, keeping the Soviets where they are and no further into anywhere else in the world, and that the dividing line of the Iron Curtain in separating Eastern and Western Europe that's as far as communism can go. And there is if you're looking at that map, like I said, and you look at Germany, Germany's really weird at this point, because at the end of World War II, the Allies divide Germany into 4 sections. So there's the Soviet section, there's the English section, the United States section, and the French section. The United States, the English, and the French are all capitalist, so that they kind of all stay. It doesn't matter who controls, if it's the French, the Americans, or the English controlling that section of Germany, but the section of West Germany, of East Germany, Germany, is communist, and that's very different. And this is kind of more of a global studies class, but I did want to kind of give you a little update on kind of what that looked like, and that's, so if you look at that map again, like, and you look up Germany itself is split because it's being occupied, because it after World War II, the world powers didn't think it could handle being on their own. So that gives me kind of a couple key things right in there. Well, the other thing is Americans and their allies, like I said, kind of Germany and Russia are kind of the big ones. They create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that allowed for easier trade between those Western European countries and Canada, so that trade could happen very easily between them, so that it was a way. We've been talking a lot about tariffs over the last few weeks, and this meant that tariffs would not be as extreme if you were a member of that NATO country. So that, it made it so that I was more likely to buy something from Britain than I was going to be to buy something from Russia. They weren't doing a whole heck of a lot of importing to the United States, but that's the idea there. And the president at this time that ends World War II and kind of starts this policy of containment officially in the United States is President Harry S. Truman, who took over for Roosevelt after he died, because he died while he was in office. And he kept up this policy of containment. I'm a fan of Harry Truman. I like him. I like the fact that his for nothing, that's his actual middle name, is just the letter S. I think that's kind of fun. So that is that. And he worked with containment in certain ways. He gave aid to Turkey and Greece, 2 countries in Europe, to make sure that they didn't become communists. So that, again, that policy of containment. So he's going to support them. After Truman, we get Dwight D. Eisenhower as the next president, and he was a huge general during World War II. He's also going to work on containment, particularly in the Middle East. So he's going to make sure that the Middle East doesn't go communist. And this leads to some really interesting, I'm going to go really quickly here through this, leads to some really interesting policies and futures in places like Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was a country that had been, and this is a little bit later, but we'll do it now because I'm talking about how Dwight D. Eisenhower was really pushing to make sure communism didn't spread in the Middle East. Well, in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, there was communism that was looking that the communists, the Russians, were in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, and the United States was pretty much willing to do just about anything to make sure that communism didn't spread to the Middle East because of doctrines like the Eisenhower Doctrine. So we trained the Afghani citizens to fight the communists. And one of the most famous people that was in Afghanistan that the United States trained and gave military power to was a man named Osama bin Laden. And I hope that name rings a bell because that is the mastermind between September 11th. So you can actually see that this period of the Cold War, which maybe I didn't give a date before, I'll give a date now. The Cold War we look at starting in 1945 and ending around 1992, 91, late 80s. There's no set time because there's no actual doctrine that gets labeled for this. So, but you can see how something that, happened in the 80s has a huge effect on something that happens in the early 2000s. So I just always think that's a good kind of tie-in. I think it's a really interesting story. All right, so the other thing on the real home front of the Cold War is the McCarthy trials. And Joseph McCarthy was a senator, and he was determined to find communist people in the United States. So he thought that people in the government, people in Hollywood, people, down the street, they were all communist, like they might be communist. Okay, so there were like these communists lurking around. And he would put these people on trial that they would be to find the communists. And do you have any back Russia? And it was called a witch hunt. And it was very much like the Salem witch trials where, very innocent people were just being brought up and then like, you are a communist. So that's what the McCarthy trials are. All right, so now we can go and finish or continue up with what we need to today. So now we are officially moving into today's work, and we are on page 83. And their first thing on there is McCarthyism. So again, the fear of the influence of communist United States. And, obviously people were against this idea that you would be brought on trial for being a communist. They thought it was violating your personal rights, which it absolutely certainly was. And so people weren't happy with that. And the House said that it was an un-American activities committee, and they kind of, after a while, kind of outlawed the trials, these Red Scare trials. Because this whole time was referred to as kind of the Red Scare, that we had this real fear that the communists were going to come into the United States. We had also a real fear, must have been on the last page, so I'll do it now. We had a real fear of nuclear proliferation, which meant that between the United States and the Soviet Union, they were building up a nuclear arms race. Oh, we have a hydrogen bomb. Oh, so do we. Well, we have an atomic bomb. Well, so do we. So there was this buildup of these militaries that were unnecessary to a degree that no one would ever need this much nuclear weapons. But the whole idea was just like, like I'm better. And it meant that we could actually blow up the world like 7 times over, like the entire world. So totally unnecessary. But as you can imagine, it was a really scary time. Kids in America practice what they call duck and cover drills, where they would be in school, and instead of like a fire drill, they'd have duck and cover where, okay, here comes an atomic bomb. We're being hit by the Russians. Your desk and wait for the atomic bomb to go off, which it's not going to do much. Hiding in your desk is not going to save you from an atomic bomb. There's fallout shelters all around the country, which were like, if we have a nuclear disaster, like this is where you would go. So it was just a really big scare of these communists that they were going to invade, they were going to attack, they were, infiltrating all of America. And I don't see it here either. We also had a space race, which was the idea of who was going to be the first into space, who was going to be the first to orbit around the Earth, who was going to be the first person on the moon, who had the best rockets. And this was the same idea, a lot less scary, sort of. I say that, but at the same time, when Sputnik, which was the first man-made satellite that went around the Earth, and the name might imply that it's Russian, it is. When Sputnik orbited the Earth, it scared the bejesus out of the United States, because if you can put something into orbit around the United States, could that be weaponized? So people were even scared of all the advancements we were making to space. So the Russians got the first satellite. The Russians had the first man in space. The United States made it first to the moon. So there was all these things that were deemed, very important, and they were hugely nationalistic. So nationalism, just like, this has all the makings of something that could have been like a World War I, right? It has all those steps. It has that nationalism, that military buildup. We're very fortunate it really never got to that level. But it was, it was a very intense time. We call the Cold War the Cold War because it doesn't have an actual war. The United States and Russia, or the United States and the Soviet Union, I do use those terms interchangeably. Technically, yeah, you are referring to the Soviet Union at this time, but it's the same place on the map, right? So the United States and Russia never officially, they don't go to war together. But they have these little satellite wars or satellite conflicts that go on. And we'll talk about 2 of them right now. And the first one takes place in Korea. And Korea is a country in Asia. It's a peninsula. It was relatively isolated for the, so many million years. And the Chinese were communist, as well as the Russians, right? There was that had become a communist country, and now we have the policy of containment. So, kind of at the end of World War II, Russia is communist, and so is China. But Korea was not. And what went on was North Korea was becoming communist, and they were moving into South Korea. The United States and its allies said, hold on, we have a policy of containment. Communism can't spread into Korea, particularly into South Korea. So the United States and its allies and the United Nations held we're going to call it a war, to keep the communists out of Korea. And I'm calling it a war because technically Congress never declares it a war. So it is a conflict, the Korean conflict. And this conflict takes place from 1950 to 1953. Again, the whole point is stopping communism from spreading. As far as the success rate, 70% of the It's not a failure. It's not a success. The idea here is they just 38th parallel, meaning that line, if you look now, you're going to get to Google another map. Check this out. Now you're going to Google Korea. Okay, and if you look on Korea today, you're going to still see North Korea and South Korea. And that line that separates the two of them is on the 38th parallel. And the parallels are the lines of latitude that go up the globe, the imaginary lines. So that's the 38th parallel, the 38th degree around the Earth, right? And so that was decided to be the drawing line. That was, communism never went below, or not permanently, never went below the 38th parallel. And kind of free or C never went above it. So to this day, we still have North Korea as a communist country and South Korea as a democracy. And North Korea is very much communist. It's one of the strongest communist countries that is still around today. But successful. The Korean War was successful in the fact that it did contain the entire peninsula of Korea did not become communist, which is great. So that's what and it's still in a stalemate. You can't to go between those countries is almost impossible. It's fascinating history. So if you're bored, you want to do some research on North and South Korea, it's fascinating. You want to watch a great TV show, MASH. Your parents and grandparents probably watched it. It has very little to do with the actual war, but it's a fun show. All right, so then that takes us to our second military conflict that we're going to look at, which is Vietnam. Very, very, very similar story. What was going on here was that in before World War I, before World War II, we talked a lot about imperialism. And in the story, the French had been an imperialist country over the country of Vietnam. And it was called French Indochina. That was the name of the country previous to the Vietnam War. So French Indochina were run by the French, and they were getting communists. The country was becoming communist, and the French were fighting the communists coming into Korea. Into Vietnam. The French, however, were unable to continue fighting the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese. So they had to kind of pull out. And so when they were pulling out of the war, they were like asking the United States, can you guys come in? And the United States did. The United States went in and fought to stop communism from coming into Vietnam. Again, you can see this policy, right? It's that element. The whole reason we were getting involved was to contain communism, was to keep communism back. This war, kind of the most part of this war for the United States Regents is how incredibly hated this war was. This was probably the most negatively perceived war that the United States has ever, even to today, ever been involved in. Home front, lots of people were protesting. There was a draft for men between the ages of 18 and 25. It was a hugely unpopular war. People were burning their draft cards. They were protesting. So that's a really important key to the U.S. side of this. Very unpopular war. Questioning, do we deserve the right to be there, or do we have the right to be there? Does this have anything to do with the United States? Why are we involved in a war in Korea, Vietnam, dealing with and keeping communism out of Vietnam? And this war, again, with kind of like looking at Korea, do we win? Do we lose? We withdrew from the war And communism did spread, and it still is in Vietnam. Vietnam is a communist country today. And so, I'm not here to debate today, whether we won or lost or anything like that. But it definitely changed the way Americans perceived war. So we definitely, we look and we analyze, should we be in wars? And that's very much because of Korea. I mean, oh my God, the Vietnam. They are two very different wars, even though I do know they sound very similar when I'm talking about them. And for the most part, for the regions wise, that's probably what you need to know. Both wars were about containment of communism, and both had limited success. The other thing that we're going to talk about next week as well, you do get one of the most popular civil Supreme Court cases out of this one as well. We get Tinker versus Des Moines, which is a story about a brother and sister who are protesting the Vietnam War in their school, and they wear black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. They're not like being rude and disrespectful. Like, a lot of them were like a little decorated. They had like a peace symbol and things like that, but they were told that they weren't allowed to wear them in school. And the Supreme Court said that, yeah, absolutely, have the right to aggression during school. There are limits to that. I will preface that right now. I'm not going to get into it right now. There are things you can't, like, have hate speech and things like that in school. I hope for obvious reasons, but you can in reality protest, the Vietnam or whatever else you want to protest in school. So we'll be talking about that more next week, because we're going to go into a lot of like Supreme Court case. We're going to do a lot of topics next week versus kind of the thematic or the timeline approach I've been taking. So we have, again, here on page 83, kind of the effects of the Vietnam War. And so, as I already kind of talked about, we look at the War Powers Act of 1973, kind of limiting the power of the president to send troops abroad, so that, the president just can't send so many troops. They do have to have Congress's permission to send a certain amount of troops. Like I also mentioned, the Korean War and Vietnam War are technically not wars, they're conflicts, because Congress never declared war on those countries. But I tend to call them wars. You're definitely not, we're not right when we say it, but it's close enough, kind of a thing. And, we looked at, Americans taking a real strong stance on foreign policy, on war, things along those lines. So that's what we want to look at there. All right, now we're turning to page 84. And we're looking at President Dwight D. Eisenhower. I mentioned that he's the president after Truman. My TV just turned blue. Now I've got a big blue thing on the back of my shoulder there. After Truman, he uses the term domino theory with communism, that it's the idea. Think right now, like when you were a kid and you weren't playing dominoes, but you were playing, like you were stacking dominoes, right? And so you put the dominoes like this, okay, or maybe do books or something. And the whole idea is, like, once you got them all lined up, you topped the first one down and all the dominoes fell down. The idea of the domino theory that was the term that Eisenhower used, was in order to keep the containment, we really need to, if one country next to it's going to go communist, and the next country next to it's going to go communist, and the country next to it's going to go communist. And he's not entirely wrong. We certainly did see that. There's very few places, and really Cuba is about the only one I can think of, where the communism wasn't kind of surrounding a country. So the idea of Korea was kind of was correct. If North Korea goes communist, South Korea would probably follow key and would also go communist. We look kind of over towards Vietnam. If Vietnam goes communist, Laos is going to go communist, Cambodia is going to go communist. And right now, I hope people are doing a little more Googling and going, where the heck are all these countries she's talking about? They're all in Southeast Asia. And guess what? It's true. Vietnam goes communist. So is Cambodia. So is Laos. I think Laos is still communist. So it is true. And like I said, Cuba, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, is kind of the odd out on that. There's like no communist countries around Cuba. So that's kind of the odd man out, which then now takes us to Cuba. So Cuba, which had been basically like United States Junior, struggled with the fact that it had been United States Junior. They had been, if you go back to when we were looking at the war with Spain, that was over Cuba. A European power. So we had been more or less controlling Cuba. And I don't just mean like the president wasn't down there like controlling Cuba. What we were doing is we were putting like very rich Americans down in Cuba, and it was kind of like a Las Vegas. So if you went down to Cuba in 1950, you were going to Vegas, baby. Like what happens in Cuba stays in Cuba. It was like a party city. Drinking, gambling, all that sort of stuff was going on down in Cuba. And it was also very much as the rich Americans who were buying up property, or the rich friends of Americans were getting richer and richer, the poor people of Cuba were getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And Castro and Che Guevara, are two revolutionaries from South and Latin America who realized, like, hey, this isn't fair. We're going to hold a communist overthrow, and we're going to make Cuba communist. And they do. And again, I'm not going to go hugely into that because that's a global thing. So for the American history exam, you just need to know that Cuba is communist and Fidel Castro becomes the dictator. And when you take global, you'll go into more detail on how that happens and why that happens. So just trust me on that. So they're communist. And here's the real kicker. So Cuba is 90 miles from Miami, Florida. So it's very, very close. And they have complete ties to the Soviets over there in Russia. And so the United States, they're like panicking. They do not want this to happen because communists a lot. We were scared of the Soviets. Now we believe that they have missiles, and these missiles in Cuba are pointing at the United States, and they're going to blow us to smithereens. This is referred to. You'll never guess what this is referred to. There being missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Sometimes we don't think too hard to make up these terms, so that's what it's referred to as the. Does Cuba have missiles pointing at the United States in Florida? And so we put a blockade on Cuba. We need to attack Cuba. We have a failed plan called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the Bay of Pigs is a location in Cuba. And this is under President Kennedy, by the way. And this is a complete failure. We are going to invade this area of Cuba. The United States is going to invade this area of Cuba. The communication was awful, and the wrong people didn't go to the right places, so it was not invaded correctly at all. It was a complete failure. So that's what you kind of need to know about the Bay of Pigs invasion, was that it was an attempt to go into it, kind of take back Cuba or to invade Cuba. And it was a complete failure only for the sheer fact that the communication breakdown was horrendous. So that's what's going on there. Again, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then Going into space a little bit more, this is officially when John F. Kennedy launches his idea of the new year, which is that, you know, the United States is going to get a man on the moon by 1965. I don't remember what, by the end of the century at the very least. He doesn't live to see the end of it. If Kennedy does get, he gets shot. And so he does not see a man on the moon, but we do get one there, and that's great. We do beat the Russians. They do get there also. I am slow at doing this, aren't I? All right, so civil rights movement. So let's get into that. So now we're just like many things in history, things are happening parallel. So the civil rights movement is going on at the same time as all this stuff with the Cold War is going on. So not exclusive to each other. They're just two things going on at the same time. They're working in parallel orders. So we see the major civil rights movement taking place in the 1960s. President Kennedy is huge in this. In fact, that's could be one of the reasons why he was shot. We're seeing lots of desegregation going on. Jackie Robinson joins a white baseball league. He's black. That would probably be a key to point out in case you didn't know. We're getting President Truman is saying that the troops have to be desegregated. So if you were in World War II, if you were a soldier in World War II, there was white divisions and black divisions. There was one referred to as the Rainbow Coalition that that was the only desegregated unit in the military at the time. We get Brown versus the Board of Education, which is the story of the young girl who is in a district where she'd be going to a black school, or she lives closer to a white school, and she should be going to the black school because she's black. And they take this to the Supreme Court that she should be going to this white school, and she does. She gets to go to the white school. The Supreme Court says that it overthrows the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson that we talked about 2 sessions ago, and says that separate is inherently not equal. You can't have a white school and a black school. They are not equal. The black school is always worse. The black school gets the worst books. They get the worst teachers. They get the, bad desks. They get the worst buildings. So it's never equal. So they start to desegregate schools all over the country, north and south. There were still segregated schools, not to the same do double check that the northern schools are also desegregating. And we have kind of one of the biggest examples of the desegregation is the Little Rock Nine, which is 9 students down in Little Rock, Arkansas, who are going to be 9 black students are going to a white school, and they're down there, and the white citizens protest these black students going into school, and so much that the 101st Airborne Division, which is the same group that stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day that we talked about last week, same division had to follow these students into school to keep them safe, which blows my mind that we needed that much military to keep those kids safe. That's how scary things were. And what is very cool is that President Johnson at the time sends the troops down to get this protection, because the state of Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas, was not supporting the forcing of the desegregation. So props to President Johnson at the time for saying, man, these kids deserve to go to school at the best school they can. And we're going to show our support by sending the military down, which is pretty cool. It takes him a little time to decide to do that, but hey, he does it. So we'll give him the props there. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about there. We can look at some leaders in the civil rights movement. I hope some of these are really familiar names. Martin Luther King Jr., a leader of the civil rights movement. He goes along with civil disobedience, the idea of this nonviolent protesting, walking, marching, things like that are just, they're quiet, but they're very, very, they're very, very powerful. He leads bus boycotts. So they were having a struggle to desegregate the busing system, and to also the idea of the Rosa Parks system, that the blacks had to sit in the back of the bus. So what basically happened is that blacks, as well as some whites, decide we're not going to ride the buses in Montgomery, Alabama until we can ride any bus wherever we want. So we're just not gonna ride the bus. And guess what? The Montgomery bus system lost a lot of money by not having any black citizens and some of their white supporters not riding their bus. This kind of goes along too with the sit-ins throughout the South. So this is where there were lunch counters. So envision going to a restaurant, and there's the certain black people weren't allowed to sit in certain sections, or weren't even allowed into that restaurant at all. Black people would go in and they would sit at the restaurant at the table that they weren't allowed to sit in. And white people would come, they would break glass bottles over their heads, and they would just sit there. It was very powerful. A lot of this was televised. Photos were taken. Northerners particularly got very upset. They hadn't really realized what was going on down there, that this was still this extreme. So that's a very powerful one. And then other leaders to look at, Malcolm X, he takes a more aggressive stance to the civil rights. He's another kind of, he gets along with Martin Luther King, but he's a little more fighting about it. He's not quite as passive about it. Rosa Parks, she's the woman who refused to give up her seat on the bus, and that's kind of where it makes her key. We get in 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act, and then in 1954, excuse me, we get the Voting Rights Act. Voting Act is the one I really want to look at. This is when, we know that black men had been given the right to vote pretty much right after the Civil War. However, there was lots of things put in place that made it impossible for them to actually vote. So they had laws like literacy exams. So if you can't read and write, you don't get to vote. Well, if you were never educated, then you're probably not going to pass that test. They put in the grandfather clause. So if your grandfather didn't vote, then you can't vote. It was actually more of a way to get white people. So if you didn't know how to read or write, but your grandfather voted, then you could still vote. The other thing that they put into place was the poll tax. So if you wanted to vote, you would have to pay to vote. And so poor blacks were obviously not willing to pay to go vote, or there was a hardship on them. So that was another way to stop them from voting. So the Voting Rights Act made all of those things illegal, so that more blacks were going to the vote. They also added more police protection so that blacks felt safe enough to be able to go and vote. And I always think this is amazing. If Civil War ends in 1865, the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act doesn't come out until 1954. That's crazy long time between getting the right to vote and actually voting. Blows my mind. We start getting affirmative action out of this, and this is kind of allowing minorities and women into places that they just hadn't been before, like colleges. It was getting numbers into those places, saying you have to have so many of a minority or this many women in schools and businesses to really have that opportunity, or allow people that opportunity. And then we move into Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency. This is my last page, and then it's just all questions after this. Lyndon Baines Johnson. So he has an idea of a great society. The idea of his society that makes it so great is that we're going to end poverty. We're going to end discrimination in the United States. It's very similar to the Fair Deal or the Square Deal. He's very, he's got this like very strong view. He comes up with the idea of Medicare and Medicaid, I think. But Medicare is medical care for the elderly. He comes up with the idea of VISTA, which VISTA is a volunteer service program, and it goes off of Kennedy's idea of the Peace Corps, John F. Kennedy's Peace Corps. And I bring this up because it's very exciting. The students I'm going to be working with at P-TECH are going to get to work with 2 VISTA members this year, so you can thank Lyndon Johnson for getting VISTA members. They do this out of the joy of their heart. They don't get paid to work with us for 1 year, which is really cool. And let's see. We talk about Johnson does bring us into Vietnam, very unpositive, unliked war. So that doesn't go well. I got Tinker versus Des Moines. So, okay, and we'll go into more of the Supreme Court cases next week again. So I'll kind of skip that. All right, now we go into Richard Nixon. Okay, big shadow over this man. He does end up with a major scandal in his presidency, and he does leave office. But that's the Watergate scandal. But that's for a few seconds, but I figured I'd give you a head start on that. Some really good things do come out of Nixon's president. He's an interesting president. Let's put it that way. He really works with the Russian government, the Soviet government, and comes up with a policy referred to as détente. And this is when things started to get a little softer. And we had tensions were being eased between the United States and the Soviets, which is great. We also have the SALT talks. SALT, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And we have 2 of these. We have SALT 1 and we have SALT 2. And the idea of these is the attempt to reduce the arms race. So we were doing the build-up, the nuclear weapons, the nuclear warheads, the nuclear bombs, right? They're building up. And then they decided, where we do many of these? And you can't just like throw out a nuclear bomb like that. So you have to come up with a way to disarm them. And you also now like Fresh is like, cool, I'll disarm my bomb. Yes, we didn't. You morons, you guys, and vice versa. So there to be like these talks like, okay, if I'm going to take down a nuclear bomb, so are you. If I'm going to do this, so are you. So this is the idea of the SALT talks. And then we start to expand some of our economic prosperity with the communist nation. So again, a little softer. We're getting some better relationships with communist China. I didn't talk too much about communist China, way more global than it is American for the purposes of right now. And then, of course, kind of all heck breaks loose for him because he has the Watergate scandal. In essence, what you really need to know is tapes that were recorded during his re-election and whether he was being truthful about them and the leaking of the Democratic Party and he ends up having to resign because he does know too much and so not only does he have to resign, his vice president resigns, a couple of other members of his cabinet also resign. And yeah, it's not a good situation for him. Oh, that's actually what I had last to talk about. Oh, all right, well, we're doing pretty good. Oh, well, we're not doing that good. We only have like 5 minutes left. And if he didn't resign, he probably would have been impeached. He would have been put on trial and removed from office. Or impeached, so he would have been found guilty and then possibly would have been removed from office. So he resigns. Again, it's a scandal of political corruption, really. That's the Watergate scandal. All right. All right, so let's go through some of our questions for today. So on page 88, we have our vocab practice. Number 1 is A, number 2 is D, number 3 is E, number 4 is G, number 5 is C, number 6 is I, number 7 is J, number 8 is H, number B, or 9 is B, number 10 is F. So 2 things there, glasnost and perestroika. They're a time of openness, very much like we were just talking about with détente, where the United States and Russia were making steps kind of towards the right direction. I believe I'm going to do a little bit more with glasnost and détente next week when we try to move into the 80s, officially into the 90s next week, and to the 2000s. And Tiananmen Square has to do with China. Again, we don't talk too much about China in the American history course. All right, and next one we're looking at is page 92. Number 1 is F, number 2 is J, number 3 is B, number 4 is D, number 5 is A, number 6 is G, number 7 is I, number 8 is E, number 9 is H, and number 10 is C. A couple things I didn't mention. So the leader of North Korea was Ho Chi Minh. I did not talk about Mao Zedong, which is the leader of communist China. And I did not talk about Nikita Khrushchev, who was one of the leaders of the Soviet Union. Again, one of the reasons I did not cover too much about them is that they are very much on that global level. Key names to know, but you don't need to know too much about them, again, because that's on that global level. The Cold War definitely is the time that is really hard in the fact that it is so close to the global classes that understanding who those people are is about all you just need to kind of be able to maybe relate them, but you don't need to go into a whole heck of a lot of information about those people. However, if you're taking global with me next year, we're going to discuss these people in much further detail. All right, and then on page 96, I'm just going to go through the numbers section, part D. Number 1 is C, number 2 is D, number 3 is D, number 4 E, number 5 is D, number 6 is B. And then on the next page, 99 and 98 and 99, this is again a breakdown of how to write an essay. So I like this one a lot. And if you want to do this activity and then send it to me, or if you've already done this activity, if you want to send it to me and I'll look at it, that'd be great. This is very much written. It is, because it is a Regents exam. And so basically what would happen here is you would have theme, right? And then you have your task. And what's nice is this is laid out so that it is the way you'd write your essay. So in this essay, you need to do these 3 bullet points. And what we've done here is this part A section, this part B section, and this part C section would all become one paragraph in your essay. So you'd write your intro, which would be based on your theme, and you'd write your first body paragraph, which would be based on part A here. You'd write your second body paragraph based on part B here, and you'd write your third body paragraph on part C here. So that I really like, and then you'd write your conclusion, of course, but I really like the way this is set up. So this is a really great practice for kind of like skeletoning out your essay. And if you want to write your essay, go for it. And like I said, if you want to do this activity, you can complete the whole act. You can complete this and send it to me, or if you want to do this in the essay and send the essay to me, that's fine. I'm more than happy to take a look at that. So know that that's an option for you. But I like the way that that's done a lot. And then we're on page 101, matching here again. Number 1 is C, number 2 is E, Number 3 is F. Number 4 is A. Number 5 is D. Number 6 is B. Number 7 is G. And then I didn't go through and answer my short answers, and we're coming close to the end of the time here. I don't want to keep everyone up too awful late. Then on page 103, you had to list people into categories. So for political leaders, I wrote, you had Johnson and Kennedy and Truman and Eisenhower and Nixon as presidents. And I wrote Warren and Marshall as members of the Supreme Court as all political leaders. And then leaders of the social movement, I said Martin Luther King, I said Malcolm X, and I said Rosa Parks. And then for the similarities, and this is really key because I thought the second one was very hard, Dr. King and Malcolm X, I wrote as civil rights leaders. Rosa Parks and Harry Truman, kind of a challenge because I don't see them as complete parallels, but I think that timing, they fall under the same time. They're cause and effect of each other. When Rosa Parks refuses to sit down, President Truman is the president. So I think that timing is really what, to me, gives them their relationship. And then kind of the same thing with Lyndon Johnson and Warren Harding taking place in the 1950s and 60s, and kind of like creating laws. They're all to do with law movements. All right, and then our last page, 2 pages for the day, are page 104. And I forgot the numbers, but I didn't even start. I didn't even remember that I started. I wrote down 2. You can't see my paper. I wrote down 2 numbers and then I stopped. So I'll just give you the answers and try to do my best at counting on the side since I didn't put numbers on them. Number 1 is 4. Number 2 is 3. Number 3 is 1. Number 4 is 4. Number 5 is 2. Number 6 is 1. Number 7 is number 4. Now I lost my count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Number 8 is 4. Number 9. Number 10 is 3. And number 11 is 2. And just so you know, even I have a master's degree, and I still, when I go through, I still cross things off to decide what when I'm doing things. So if you look here, when I was looking at this question, I went through and I saw the number 1. I looked at it and I'm like, I don't know if that's going to be my only thing. So I went through and I decided number 1 was the right answer, not because I was like, yeah, number 1's the right answer, but because the other didn't make any sense. The others didn't work. So even with kind of my that technique, and you see it over here a lot. I did the same thing. I looked and I started crossing off what were things that I thought were right, and what were things that I thought were wrong. And what the Regents, I think, is my theory, what I think happens on the Regents exam, and they both sit down to them, I think they put 2 in that are just wrong. And I think the idea is that you're supposed to guess 50-50. So I think if you can go into the exam and start crossing off things that were just straight up wrong, then I think then you now get yourself down to a 50-50 shot. So take the time to kind of think and analyze how you're going to write some questions, how you're going to answer the questions themselves. So next week when we do this, hopefully everything should get a little bit shorter because we have a little less to cover. I know it looks like more, but a lot of it is charts and stuff. And so we'll be looking at that next week. And I will get some, I do have someone on the chat who wants some work. I will get that work back out to you. That won't be a problem. So I hope everyone has a really great night. I will see you next week. I believe we're meeting again on Tuesday next week. And you'll also be getting information very soon on some reviews in person leading up to the Regents. Right. So have a great night. Thank you for joining. Have a good night.